There we go. So in today's class, we'll mainly focus on the, and just a quick question, and you don't need to type it in, but for those of you on camera, do you see the full screen? Give me a thumbs up if you do. You see the full screen? Yeah? You see, Paul, do you see the full screen? Do you see any gray area around it? Okay, thank you. Awesome. Thank you, Dan. Appreciate the California hang loose. Awesome. Okay, great. I'm asking because unfortunately I am one screen today, one of the benefits of traveling, but glad this is working out. Fantastic. So let's chat a bit more then. So to give a bit of definition, right? So when I'm talking about asset management here, we're talking about the process of essentially tracking and managing any of the tools and systems that you're using to keep your business afloat, to make your business function, essentially, right? So in today's class, we're going to talk about the fundamental piece of cybersecurity, which is asset management. Why I say it's fundamental is because it is, in order for your business to function and in order for your security system to be as efficient and hardened as possible, you need to have an asset management process and an asset management program. Now, the opposite of not having an asset management program is called ad hoc IT. Ad hoc IT is essentially where it's on the go. You don't know what data you have. You don't know what systems are at your disposal. You don't know the different assets you're using. And some of these assets are lost in the complexity of all the assets you have. Now, this is very common for large organizations because they tend to have so many tools, so many systems, so many assets that they forget that they already have a tool in place. And if asset management isn't there, well, then you might find yourself as an IT resource buying a new system when you already have a system that exists that does the same thing. So the opposite of asset management is essentially chaos. Now, a good organization does have an asset management, mainly because as a business, you can't function efficiently if you don't have asset management. So we'll talk a little bit more about how that's done, why it's important, especially from a cybersecurity standpoint. What I mean by that is we want to make sure that we understand what assets we have. We want to understand how we get those assets, how to protect them, how to manage them. We also want to make sure that we're protecting them accordingly because these assets are not just pieces of hardware or software that we're using on our network. These assets also include different hardwares and services that accomplish the goal of our business. Now, we've used the example of Salesforce in the past, right? Salesforce is a customer relationship management tool. It stores emails and customer information. It helps you sell deals or close deals and whatnot. And they use different external services in order to make it work. Now, an asset, if you remember, yes, it talks about data because we have talked about data in the past, but assets can also be a service. It can be a service or a software or a tool that is used to accomplish the business goal. In this case, the business goal is to be able to store contact information in order to sell, right? That's the business goal. Now, what's important to understand here is that asset management goes through a bit of a life cycle. It's called asset management life cycle, and it's a continuous process. There's the planning process, then there's the acquisition of the asset. There are a couple steps in the acquisition phase that we'll run through, followed by operations, meaning like it's being implemented and it's actually working. When it's working, then we go into the maintenance phase. The maintenance phase is often overlooked by a lot of businesses because they are just wanting to use the tool in order to accomplish a goal, period. They're not really interested in what are the things we need to do in order to maintain it. Then there's decommissioning. The decommissioning is if the tool is no longer needed or that tool has become obsolete. The business may have morphed or changed or upgraded in such a way that it's not required to use that tool anymore. That, or maybe the tool or service you were using had a data breach. If it had a data breach, then you need to decommission it. Decommissioning it doesn't mean just uninstalling it. It also means cleansing it, making sure you're taking out all the data, making sure that all credentials associated with that service or software are completely removed. And then it goes through a cycle again of planning, acquisition, operation, maintenance, and decommissioning. The reason why it's a continuous loop is that there's never going to be a time when one asset is going to be used for the entire life cycle of your business. Meaning there are going to be times when you're going to need to adjust and upgrade or downgrade. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. So in this class, the things that we want to definitely cover is we want to talk about what asset management is, why it's important. We also want to understand the life cycle that it goes through, all the way from acquisition to decommissioning. And then we want to talk about the techniques that are required to monitor and track it, followed by different security implications if we don't follow those stages. And then finally, we want to identify some risks that may be associated with hardware, software, any data applications that would follow. All right. So we got a good amount of stuff to go through today. However, I think that we'll be able to run through everything quite easily. So if you do have questions, please put them in the live chat. I'll try to keep an eye on the live chat in order to keep it going. Very smart, Andre. Unfortunately for me, I only have my MacBook this time. All right, let's talk about asset management in definition. So like I said, asset management is the process of tracking and managing physical and digital assets, IT assets. Now, as a reminder, an asset is not just a piece of data. Yes, it is customer data, it's company data, it's anything that hackers will want to get after, right? But an asset can also be a specific software. It can be a hardware. An example, your computer, your work computer is an asset. The server, like the web server or the data server, those are assets. Any intellectual property or any network devices such as like routers or switches, those are also assets. Now, something else that's not talked about a lot is that another asset is actually people. So people are considered assets because they are, think of like if you've ever seen like a James Bond movie or an Ethan Hunt movie or something like that. Sorry, I know I unshared my screen for a second there. If you ever seen one of those movies, well, then they talk about, oh, engage the asset. The reason why they're called an asset is because secret agents are seen as tools in order to accomplish a specific goal. Now, in those movies, those assets tend to be resources that are lethal, that are used for different purposes. But in IT and security, an asset is any specific item, person, or technological tool in order to accomplish the organizational goal, as well as protect the organization overall. Now, the way that NIST described it is anything that has value to the organization. So yes, people do have value and different systems also have value. The way that I like to think of it is just anything that makes the business valuable, anything that enables the business to accomplish their goal. Now, let's talk a little bit about why asset management matters. Now, it helps because you need to, in order to have asset management, you need to have an inventory of all of your assets. That means understanding what hardwares we have. How many computers do we have available to employees? We have 5 new employees that are coming on. Great. We have 20 computers. Well, then they can have 5 of them, right? And then it's understanding, it's ensuring that you're in compliance with all the different frameworks. Now, let me go back real quick to talk about what are some examples of assets. We talked about hardware, right? Example of hardware is your computer, softwares, workstations, phones. So if you're given a company phone, that's an asset, as well as any networking devices. Also, there are different softwares that can be considered asset. Something as like different applications, your operating system is considered an asset. Different system licenses can be an asset. For example, Salesforce, in order to have a Salesforce login, you need to have a license. So that license is considered an asset. Of course, you all are already familiar with the fact that data is considered an asset. So you want to make sure to understand and have an inventory of your files, your databases, that kind of stuff, okay? Now, other reasons why asset management matters is because if you understand the assets you have on your network and in your business, well, then you have a better ability to do risk assessment. As a reminder, a risk assessment is looking at all of the different applications, all your different business processes, and then understanding where you currently are and then where your ideal security posture would be and finding out the gap in between. Now, if there are gaps, well, then you're able to pinpoint those gaps a lot easier when you know what assets you have. And then you also want to prevent shadow IT. As a reminder, a shadow IT is when unauthorized software or unauthorized devices are used on your network. Here's a classic example. A lot of people like to use PDF converters. So a lot of people will have like a Google document or a Word document, and they'll try to convert it to a PDF, or they try to convert a PDF to a Word document, vice versa, right? It's very common. Now Google and Word have a built-in feature to download as a PDF, but more often than not, we'll see people try to download from PDF to a document. Now, when that happens, they'll typically use an online tool called a PDF converter. A lot of these PDF converters are actually malicious. They take the data, and then when they spit out the Word document, it is typically associated with malware. That's an example of shadow IT, where you're using a software or a service that is not allowed. When you have asset management, you're able to track that and then disallow the use of those softwares. So you now understand a bit more about how asset management works and why it's important. One of the first steps in the life cycle of asset management is planning and acquisition. So the planning and acquisition process is essentially a way to add structure to an organization's way of planning, purchasing, and integrating any services or softwares that they want to implement into the business. Now, there's a strong emphasis on security in this step. This is why we have what we call third-party risk management. The third-party risk management team or individual are the people who do the planning process, where they look at the different softwares that are available and they find out, hey, what are the security risks associated with this specific software? What are some things we should be aware of? What are some things that we should be careful about? All of these are different examples of what is required in the acquisition and procurement process. Now, the process is pretty, I would say, I don't want to use the term sophisticated, but I'll use the term involved. Why I use the term involved is because when we're going to add a new software or a new system into our network or our operations, keep in mind, we're taking on all of the security risk with that new software. We're taking on additional risk. Anytime you're adding a new software, unless it's clear cut on its security model and its security posture, well, then it's a level of risk. So we definitely need to do what we call a security needs analysis. So when we go into the planning and needs assessment, we need to talk about the security needs analysis, which is essentially how we evaluate what security controls are needed on the new asset. Now, a very basic security control is access management, right? You need to make sure that at the very minimum, that tool has what we call two-factor authentication, some way of doing that. A lot of the tools that exist today have that because it is a requirement in order for them to be sold nowadays. But that's one of the first things we need to do. We need to understand what are the security controls we need to have around that specific asset to make sure that it is protected. Now, keep in mind, we're always thinking about defense in layers, right? As in security in depth. So we're right now thinking about the asset itself. So we want to think of, okay, this is the asset. What are the security things on that specific asset? Okay, that's the first thing we want to talk about. Eventually, we'll go into, okay, how do we protect the asset? Where does it live on our network? Is it in the DMZ? Is it behind our internal firewall along with our data servers? Where does that live? But we'll talk about that later on. After you do a security risk assessment, excuse me, after you do a security needs analysis, then you do the risk assessment. Now, the risk assessment, like I said before, is done by the third-party risk management team typically, and it is to understand the impact of bringing the product in and what are the potential pitfalls. Are there any risks to that system that could put the organization in danger? Okay, thank you, TAs, for covering these questions. I'm unable to see. Yes, Saida, employees can be assets. Are there any tools used for asset management? Yep, there are a lot of different tools out there. Believe it or not, one of the tools is just Excel. So if you have an Excel document that has all of your assets, how many devices you have, then you have to have what we call version control on it. You need to have it listed, when was the last updated, by who, and then you need to be able to go to the different versions to be able to see how many devices went to who, that kind of stuff. Excel is like a very common tool, but there are other tools out there. I think Qualys is one of them. So you could all look into that. So we talked about security needs analysis, then we talked about risk assessment. Something else I want to add here is when we're doing the planning and needs assessment process, we need to also evaluate compliance. So we need to know, depending on your business, if there are specific compliance standards that we need to do in order to have proper access management. For example, do we need to have specific asset management for HIPAA? Do we need to have specific asset management for GDPR, CCPA? Now, GDPR and CCPA are very important because they're specifically related to data, and we need to know what data we have, how long we've had it, where it's being stored. Those are the basics, right? And so for us as security professionals, when we're planning, let's say, a new database system to query the data, right? Well, then we need to understand what piece of data it has access to, because then if an auditor comes in and says, hey, here's all your data and all your data servers, what are all the systems that connect to that data server, and what kind of information do they gather? How often do they gather it, and what access do they have? I know that's a bit of a mouthful, but think of it this way. Here's your data, who has access to it, why, how, when, right? That's all that auditors are asking. This is an actual question I saw an auditor ask, and we had to provide them proof of all the different systems that have access to the data, how often they access it, and why, okay? Now, the reason why audits can be pretty stressful is the auditor can ask anything they want in the realm of that security, in the realm of that compliance standard. So we as security professionals have to come prepared with evidence to support our case. And so if we fail, well, then that means we get an observation or a finding. If that observation or finding is found to be legitimate, then we could have a potential issue in compliance on our side. All right. After that, we have vendor and product evaluation. Now, the vendor and product evaluation is essentially where we look at all of our needs as an organization, and then we look at all of the available products, services, and teams out there that can accomplish that goal. Okay, let's say that I'll give you a real example. When I was in my MBA, I was working in the finance department of our university. I was tasked with the vendor selection of a new accounting software. Now, the accounting software required me to do a security criteria, right? So security criteria is essentially defining what security features a vendor or a product must have in order for us to deem them as qualified. What I mean by qualified is we say, hey, do you have access control? Do you have encryption? Do you have MFA? These are all basic foundational criteria that we need. So in essence, if I were to try to get a new accounting software like the one I did back in the day, well, then I would need to ask these questions, and I probably would not be able to go with a startup because the startup may not have all the security features that I'm looking for, right? So a very good indication of how good a software is what compliance standard they abide by. An example, If they abide by ISO 27001, well, then I know that they have a bunch of security features, and then as well as SOC 2. Now, if you're unfamiliar, SOC 2 is essentially, it's called the Security Organization Control, and it's actually made by the accounting organization. So the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants. And there are three types of SOC. There's SOC 1, SOC 2, and SOC 3. Now, I won't go into depth into each of them, but essentially what they're trying to prove is say, hey, we are SOC 2 certified, which means that we meet the accountant standard of security controls in order to protect data. SOC 2 is a really great indication that an organization has all of the security controls you need in order to be secure. This is why compliance is so important, okay? Because if you're compliant with one of these standards, well, then it automatically checks the box. It's less work for the security professional to say, okay, do you have this? Do you have this? Do you have this? Instead, you say, I'm SOC 2 certified. We say, great, you're in the running to be one of our systems. And then there's vendor security assessment. Now, the vendor security assessment is essentially where we look at all the different reviews posted by other companies. We ask for testimonials. We look to see if there are any third-party audits that was done, any security certifications, and then we do like a vulnerability assessment. Now, the vulnerability assessment typically will ask the vendor, when was the last time you did a pen test? When was the last time you did a vulnerability assessment? And then they tell us, or they give us a third party's report of their vulnerability assessment. Now, because we're selecting a vendor, obviously it takes time and money. So we have to be conscientious of the fact that we can't do all of these assessments. More often than not, the reality is that we ask the organization or the different softwares what their security assessments are, where their security posture is, and then we go from there. Okay. All right. I think we talked about that. And then there's negotiation and contract drafting. Now, this is just a real business part of it. So there is something called security clauses. Anytime you buy a new software, well, then you'll sign an SOW, which is a statement of work, service level agreement, so an SLA, as well as an MSA, which is a master service agreement. All three of these are legally binding documents that define what the software does, how long it should be out for, and there is what we call a security clause. Now, the security clause is a section within those three documents that typically talks about data protection, breach notification standards, and steps, and then security audit rights. It's essentially a section where both parties are legally protected from the security standpoint, meaning that we are, if anything were to go wrong from a cybersecurity perspective from the vendor, well, then we have a documented process and list of the things that they need to do in order to be compliant and still be in alignment with all the different documents that are signed. Now, I jumped the gun. I mentioned the SLA. So an SLA stands for a service level agreement. And essentially, the way I like to think of it is it defines the availability of that service, as well as it gives us a pretty clear indication of the security steps needed, right? So think of it as a way to measure, typically measured in time, all the security expectations and timelines if an issue were to happen. A very classic example, which is why availability is so important in the CIA triad, is if that service becomes unavailable. So if we go back to our Salesforce example, and Salesforce has an outage, if Salesforce has an outage, they have SLAs with different companies that say, hey, if your system is down for X number of hours, that costs us money. So either you have to pay us, or you have to discount us for the next year, or we will sue you, something along those lines. So SLAs are a way for the business, the purchasing business, to tell the team, you need to remain available, or you need to let us know if you experience a breach by a certain amount of time. This is why the term measurable is really important, is because it lists out the exact time, like a measurable numerical time that the vendor has to adhere to in order to be compliant with the documents that are signed. So let's say we did that. We did the negotiations, we did the assessments, we found out all the different teams, all the different clauses that we need to include into the documents. Now we go through an approval and purchase program. Now, typically during the acquisition and procurement process, senior leadership is not involved yet. The key decision makers aren't involved yet. These are individual contributors and team members that go through this entire process. Then it goes to the people that kind of make the bigger decisions. Now it'll go through a security review before it goes into approval. So this typically means that it's sent to a team or a person that does their own security review and signs off on that vendor. So this is supposed to be a subject matter expert, someone who has been in the organization for years, have been in the industry for years, and they're the ones who sign off on if a software is secure enough for us to use or not. So that essentially gives us the final say, and then it goes to collaboration between departments. Now, the collaboration between departments is important because when we're acquiring a new tool, first of all, there's the team that requested the tool that needs to be involved, and then there's the team that there's the legal team that we need to get involved because they need to know all the softwares that exist in the IT infrastructure so that if we were to get sued or if there were any legal issues, well, then the legal team would be involved and know how exactly to address it. The other teams that we also want to include are obviously IT, cybersecurity, and then any operations team that may need to be involved, right? So typically, there are operation teams that request a certain software or request a certain vendor, and so they'll be involved in the implementation process, in the changing process, all that kind of stuff. Okay. And then there's post-acquisition and integration. In short, this is the implementation of the tool, right? So what we want to do is essentially you implement said tool, and then once you implement it and once it's been integrated, making sure that it works correctly, you'll go through a monitoring and evaluation feature. So that means that we monitor the performance of the tool. We try to make sure that it's functioning as needed. We track any updates, track any patches, maybe any emerging risks. We just keep an eye on the overall use and function of that tool so that we can update it as needed. And then there's the vendor relationship management. So vendor relationship management is essentially centered on maintaining communication with the vendor and reviewing the performance of the tool accordingly. Now, this is important because typically it's done on a monthly basis, and it's for the vendor just to check in with the purchasing team and say, hey, how's the tool working? Are there any bugs? Do you have any concerns? There are two reasons for this. The first reason is because the vendor wants to proactively help the purchasing team should anything not function the way they want it to. And then secondly, it's good for the purchasing team because they have an open line of communication with the vendor. What you don't want to happen is zero communication with the vendor at all, because then if an issue does come up, well, then you won't know who to reach out to. You won't already have like a line of communication. You need that constant communication in order to yay or nay a situation. So this is the entire process when it comes to the acquisition and procurement of a new vendor. All right, check the chat. Is it advisable to use a hardware software till end of life before replacing it? So, yep, Oybek answered it quite perfectly. It depends. Typically, if a hardware is around for like 10 years or so, and it might not be compatible with other platforms and software, so that might be a time to kill it. Yeah, everything Oybek said. Great question, Corbina. Great question. All right, let's move on. Now let's talk a little bit more about assignment and accounting. Now, assignment and accounting, in very simple terms, is just the process of giving accounts, like actual user login information, to these different tools. That's all this means. So I like to think of it as the process of assigning assets to specific users or departments, and then keeping, and this is important, keeping an accurate record of who has access to what, their current status, and then the location throughout the asset's lifecycle. Why is this important? Well, when we're talking about giving people access, we're dealing with people. People join and leave the organization as they change roles within the organization. And then again, all of this is centered around the concept of access control and the principle of least privilege. So when we give access to a system, we need to keep track of it. We need to monitor and know who has access to it and what, so that we can decommission them or take away their access. Let's say if they potentially become an insider threat. So here's a scenario. If someone is deemed an insider threat, what typically happens is the manager will send an email to the IT security team or the IT compliance team and say, hey, we would like you to monitor this user. We don't believe that they're an insider threat yet, but they have a high likelihood of becoming because they've been disgruntled. Maybe they've exhibited odd behavior at the workplace or what have you. So what the security team does is they monitor that user. Now, that's why we need to know what they have access to so that we can monitor what they're doing in all of these systems in case they're trying to exfiltrate any sort of information. So this is a security reason why it's important. So there are several things that we need to do that make this important. One of the big ones is risk management. So risk management is, like I mentioned before, we need to be able to identify the different users that are in there, any of the assets accordingly. We also need to understand the sensitivity of the assets. Is this asset used for operations, or is it used for anything else, right? And then enhanced compliance. This is just saying that when we have a specific asset or specific user, we can then understand how they function, why they're in that system to begin with, and be able to tell the compliance and auditors or explain that to the auditors. The auditors are going to ask two questions. Why is this person in this system? And then for how long? Why are they in the system and for how long? Those are two big reasons why. And then they'll typically follow up with, do they still need to be in the system? This is why UAR, user access review, is really important, because then we know who's in what system and why. And then the other one is optimizing asset utilization. Now, when we track the ownership and usage of different softwares and assets, well, then we can know that we're actually getting our money's worth. So an example is if you buy a Netflix membership, but your life is so busy that in 1 month you watch maybe one episode of a TV show. That's an example of not using or not optimizing your asset utilization. Because if Netflix is your asset, you're only using it once, you're essentially losing money. So you want to make sure that you're using it correctly and that it doesn't become what we call an unnecessary purchase. This is why the planning process is so important, because we need to fully understand the why behind putting that vendor into our system. Now, a part of asset management is ownership. So we need to fully understand who owns a specific asset. Now, this means that we need to understand a clear assignment of the user as well as department that is responsible for the asset. That asset should not be an IT or security's responsibility. IT and security vet it and they implement it, but the ownership of that asset should be the department that requests it, as well as a very specific owner. Now, asset, remember, data, equipment, that kind of stuff, right? A very simple example is a work laptop. A work laptop should have a very specific serial number, that is tied to an individual employee. That's a clear example of ownership of an asset. So when we have ownership of an asset, when we know who owns it, we need to keep clear records. Like I mentioned before, having a clear record of who owns what asset is important for risk management, compliance, overall security, right? So this process is pretty, I would say, rigorous because it's just maintenance. It's saying, hey, on a monthly basis, does this team member still work here? Does this team member still have this laptop? Does this team member still have access to all these softwares? These are all elements of ownership. Now, why we track them is because, let's say you have someone like a salesperson who travels a lot, right? If they travel a lot, well, then we need to know the location of their specific laptop, and we need to know if that location of that laptop is compromised, whether it's stolen, lost, what have you. So for those reasons, we need to keep a record of it so that we can protect that asset, maybe remote wipe it, or be able to get it back for whatever reason. And then we go into asset classification. Now, asset classification is a really great way to better understand how your assets are grouped together. Now, as you can imagine, some of these assets can be like laptops. They can be laptops, phones. Those would be considered like employee assets. Then switches and routers, those would be considered like network assets. These are all different categories. However, in this case, we also want to understand the sensitivity of those assets. For example, data is highly sensitive. So because data is highly sensitive, we want to protect it more. We want to put a lot more protections around that. And then we also want to say, hey, another asset that we have is, let's say we have a server that just processes images, right? These are marketing images. Marketing images are public. They're being sent publicly in order to gain customers. So that has less sensitivity in and of itself, okay? So the classification essentially helps us understand the level of protection that needs to go around it and the level of controls we need to put around that specific asset. And then we already talked about hardware and software. So the reason why it says classify, I would even say clarify it's hardware or software, is because if you're an IT resource, well, then you might have a new IT resource that comes in. If they come in, well, then they'll be like, oh, what is Nessus? Or they should know what Nessus is, but they may ask like, oh, what's this specific platform? Is it hardware or is it software? And then we need to keep record of that so that we can essentially explain, hey, this is a critical asset, this is non-essential, kind of like just keeping track of it. And then data classification, we had a whole class on this before. Actually, I lied. I think we're going to have an additional class on this later. So I'll talk about that down the line. But in essence, it's understanding what data you have in your system, what's the criticality, if it's going to be a business continuity issue, if that data gets leaked, and anything policy or storage related that we need to have in place. Accounting for assets. Accounting for assets is just explaining, hey, what assets do we have? Hence the asset inventory. When we're talking about asset inventory, we're trying to understand all of the assets that exist in our system, any tracking, any logging, any changes that occurred. Well, then this is where we would do that. Now, someone asked earlier about if there are any tools out there. So there are specific tools for asset management and asset inventory management, because as you can imagine, a really large organization has a really large asset management, a large asset base, right? And so typically they want to find something that's easy to use, that's easily manageable, where we can track all of our assets. And then there's asset lifestyle management. So this is where we understand the status of each asset. So it's where we know if it's active, under repair, or if it's decommissioned. So sometimes this will come in the form of a dashboard. where we'll say, hey, we have 115 assets, 113 of them are active, 2 of them are decommissioned, 1 of them is under repair. It's kind of like a snapshot view of that understanding, okay? Auditing and verification. So auditing and verification is just making sure we have, in short, an audit trail. An audit trail is really important. That means we need to understand when, ever since that asset has been implemented, who touched it, who configured it, any issues associated with it. And we need to have a document that lists all of that so that an auditor can go through and read it and understand it. Okay. That's all the audit trail is saying, is like having a traceable and accountable document that will help us state compliance and can be used as evidence. True or false? Oh, wait, we got one question here. Any function in asset management that accounts for depreciation, like when to write off? Yeah, so really great question. So let me see. How do I answer that without getting overly technical here? So in short, if and when to kind of explain Mustafa's question here, they're essentially asking if we have, when you buy a new car, the minute you drive it off, well then it becomes like it becomes less valuable, which means that it's being used over time, right? And so if we're talking about depreciation, if like the software is like not functioning as well, or if it's starting to lose its functionality, a very common example is if the organization or the company that you bought the asset from is going out of business and it's no longer being used anymore, well then you want to think about, okay, how do we go ahead and depreciate it? The function in this case would be something in the SLA where it says, hey, if your software isn't delivering on its promise and if it isn't working right anymore, well, then these are the steps that you as an organization can take. The process to do that is to do the monitoring step, monitoring the performance of that asset, monitoring if it's still functioning the way we expect it to. My laptop at work is kind of inferior to my colleagues. Someone jokingly asked me to drop it so I could get the recent version. I was like, they should have called for them. Yeah, so it's a money thing. It's a money thing when it comes down to it, because a lot of organizations, they'll try to not incorporate new systems or new hardware until it's completely required. They'll typically see a drop in productivity if those assets are too old. All right, quiz time. True or false thread? According to NIST, assets in an organization can only be tangible, such as hardware. True or false? That is correct. So like I mentioned before, if you're going to remember anything from this lesson, an asset can be defined not just as hardware, or it can be software, it can be a human asset as well. All right, this actually answers the question that Muslihudin, or it wasn't Muslihudin, it was Mustafa. Mustafa had asked in regards to monitoring and tracking. So when it comes to monitoring and tracking for asset management, I like to think of it as oversight. What I mean by oversight is IT is keeping an oversight or a status of all the IT assets in its network, and then we're ensuring that security and functionality is still persistent. Okay, that's all. That's all. That's all it means, right? Now, in this case, the concept of oversight means continuous visibility. You want to know how all of your assets are functioning, if they're functioning as expected, and if they're delivering what they promised they would deliver. At its core, it's just visibility, needing visibility from the IT standpoint. Why do we need visibility? For one, it's for risk mitigation. We want to proactively know if our system is at risk. Remember the CVEs that I talked about before? All of those assets could have a CVE that's out there. So as an IT team, some researcher is looking at all the CVs and saying, hey, do we have Ivanti? We do have Ivanti. Well, they have a CVE out. We're at risk. And we need to know if all of our versions are patched to exclude that vulnerability. So we will only know that if we're monitoring and tracking all of those assets, okay? So the monitoring and tracking of our assets reduces our risk surface. Obviously, there's also compliance and auditing. So a lot of compliance standards and audits out there require you to understand the status of all of your assets, as well as, very importantly, the patching program of your assets. Now, there's typically someone called a risk management professional on the IT security team, and one of their roles is patch management, meaning all the hardware, all the softwares have to be patched within a certain amount of time, and they're the ones in charge of the full patching system, okay? So that's a part of the compliance and auditing process. Now, we mentioned inventory before, right? So as far as inventory management goes, we need to make sure that we understand all of the assets in our inventory and then why, right? Now, a very common way to do this to find out what the assets are is to have an automatic discovery tool. This is typically a network-wide automatic discovery tool, because it's essentially allowing us to say, hey, this is our network. The network and the tool knows exactly what lives on that network, how many devices are there. It tracks if there are any guests that enter the guest network, and it also tracks if a new system enters that network. Now, the tracking of that new system is going to say, hey, I automatically detected that there is a new system or a new tool that is on our network. Because I know this, I can go ahead and document that on our back end. Now, when I say documentation and everything, that doesn't mean that humans have to do all of it. You can automate that entire process. We just need to know who logged into what or which asset has been added into our network. And then there's a centralized asset database. Now, the centralized asset database concept is essentially having one go-to place for all of your data. Now, there are arguments against this. Some people saying we don't want to centralize all of our data. I've seen some systems to where they have multiple different data sets. So one data can be PII data, one data can be like payment information data, and one piece of data can be like data used by operations. Typically, all three of these databases are all assets, right? But they're all put in their own segment. However, there are tools out there that can query all of these databases. That's the centralization platform. Now, there's something called SQL query, where you can type in a formula that looks at all of your data and spits out data in a format that you want, right? That is a form of centralized asset database, but more often than not, it's typically advised to separate them. That being said, when we want a centralized asset database, it's essentially meant to understand the types of data that we have, different locations. Very important to also understand who the owner is. Typically, we'll have an owner and a sub-owner in case that owner is unavailable should something happen. And then we also need to be sure that those asset databases remain accessible to the different stakeholders. When I say stakeholders, they can be operations team internally, or if your tool requires an external customer to have access to that database, that remains access to them as well. Now, a key element here of keeping that data accessible is they need to be updated in real time. That means there's typically an automated system or an automated infrastructure that allows it to be automated dynamically. So if you have a piece of data, someone requests their data be deleted by CCP or GDPR, well, then you can have an automated system that deletes their data immediately. And then that way it's completely up to date. And then we have asset tagging and labeling. Now, this is really important because anytime you have an asset, you need to be able to label it accordingly and tag it accordingly, which is typically why they have RFID tags or barcodes. If you've ever been given a work computer, your work computer will typically have a barcode on it that the IT person will scan. When they scan it, it goes into their system. If it's in their system, they know that you used it, right? So what this does is it automates the tracking process so that we know where that device is and who's used it, the last time it's been scanned, so on and so forth. All right, I think we're gonna save the rest of this for the second half because I don't want to. All right, so the next thing I wanted to talk about was enumeration, right? So when it comes to enumeration, this is a really important process to understand because enumeration is just the process of identifying and categorizing assets in a network. Enumeration can also be likened to the term discovery or reconnaissance, right? Because its entire goal is to give us an understanding of all of understanding or an overall overview of the assets in and of themselves, right? Now, this can typically done with a searching tool such as Nmap. It essentially looks at all the services and tools that are available on the network, or using any enumeration protocols, right? Then there's something called a CMDB that stands for a Configuration Management Database. So what this does is it essentially does enumeration, but it also documents all the configurations, maybe any other services or systems that are tied to that specific service. And it gives us, like, I like to think of it as a really big map for an understanding of all the services and networks that are available. Now, this is important because it gives us a visual. It gives a visual so we understand all of the changes that are happening in a network, or maybe what incident is happening in a network, okay? The configurations are important because then we can understand where exactly anything needs to have more of our attention. I already mentioned version control before, if you remember, because if we're tracking all of our asset inventory, if we're tracking all of our assets, well, then obviously it's going to change. Different users are going to need access to different things. And so it's our job to make sure that we understand what those changes were. So having different version controls and documentation is not only helpful for us from a reporting standpoint, but it also helps us keep us compliant. No, believe it or not, when you have different version controls available to you, well, then that's already an auditing trail in and of itself, okay? Now, advanced asset tracking techniques. So there are different advanced asset tracking techniques that exist out there, such as real-time location tracking. What this does is it helps us kind of understand where all of our assets are in real time. The easiest example of this is if you have an iPhone, well, then it tracks where all of your devices are at all times in real time. And this is important because then we can actively know if a device has been stolen or if it's in a location that we know it shouldn't be. Utilization monitoring, all this is saying is we understand who's using it and for how much time, followed by integration of security tools. So this is just making sure that we are integrating any other security tools out there for the sake of protecting that asset or protecting the configuration or overall security posture of that asset, okay? So in short, I would say that monitoring and asset tracking are really important for overall asset management because when we monitor and track all of our assets, we understand what's happening within that asset and when. Okay, so those are the main reasons why monitoring and asset tracking are important. Okay, now when it comes to disposal and decommissioning, there are a couple things we need to know. The definition of disposal is essentially the final stage in the IT process and the IT asset lifecycle, and its entire goal is to securely retire hardware and software so that it's no longer in use. That's the entire goal. So you might be asking, well, why is this important? Why do we need to make sure we have a very well-defined disposal, and decommissioning process? Well, part of it is to prevent data breaches, because when we have uh, de- the correct decommissioning process, well, then we protect data from being deleted. Fun fact, something I used to do with some of my colleagues is dumpster dive. We would dumpster dive for different hard drives that were thrown away, and then we would have very complex forensic tools that's able to dig into all of those hard drives. Even if you wipe it or delete it, there are ways to get some of that partial information back, right? So that's an important piece of it. That's an important reason why you need to properly decommission it, which typically involves fire. We typically either use fire to decommission it, or we use a drill to completely drill through it, make it completely unusable. So that protects breaches. And then a lot of compliance standards out there, they do require you to have a decommissioning process or document. So this means that you need to have a way to say, hey, this has been fully deleted, fully taken care of, and it no longer exists. I know that HIPAA has very strict rules on decommissioning, because if you have a server or a hard drive that has personal health information, you need to have proof of its decommissioning process. There's something called a decommissioning certificate, meaning that after you decommission it, well, then you get a certificate saying this device with this serial number, which is tied to this specific barcode, has officially been deleted and decommissioned on this date. And that certificate is served as evidence as full deletion. And then environment responsibility. Believe it or not, in cybersecurity, we don't believe in polluting the world and making it worse. So you need to make sure that you're ethically decommissioning. So you could burn all of your hardware and then cause some emissions, or you can recycle it, and then that means that you're causing less emissions in the world and you're doing less damage. Now, why do we care about environmental responsibility? Well, one of the reasons why we care about that is because with environmental responsibility comes a team called sustainability. Sustainability's goal is to make sure that the organization is not causing more harm to the earth than it's doing. And why is this important is because it props up your reputation and it makes you more likable in the eyes of your stakeholders as well as your customers. Then there is data sanitizations. So there are different ways that you can sanitize data. So there's software-based wiping. You can use softwares in order to override certain areas of storage, such as storage devices or different servers. And then one of the things you can adhere to is the NIST SP 888. So that's around data erasure. The process of burning or drilling any of your assets, your hardware assets, can be called physical destruction. So that's where you literally just either burn it or you drill through it. And then the last one is degaussing. Now, there is a really cool scene in the movie Knives Out. In Knives Out, the main character uses a magnet to essentially render a piece of data unreadable. In this case, the data was a video file. And so this magnet process is called degaussing. You're using very strong magnets to disrupt the overall hard drive, and then that makes it unreadable. Okay, correlation one team, I'm going to proactively stop sharing here. And then if one of you could please share your screen, because mine's about to die. And then if you could just share, I think that was slide 6.
Yeah, I'm gonna share now.
Thank
Awesome.
you.
Thank you, Oibek. Appreciate you. Thank you. Thank you. All right. So the next thing we're talking about is destroying hardware. And awesome. Thank you, Oibek. So when we're talking about destroying hardware, like I mentioned before, there's a certification process. So when you destroy the hardware, well, then it can typically be done by a vendor, it can typically be done by a third party, but the entire goal is that they are built and made to destroy hardware. So they give you that certificate saying, hey, that hardware has been completely destroyed, so you are good to go. That certificate of destruction is what you can use and keep on record for any assets that you've had in the past that have been destroyed. Typically, you want to store these for as long as you can for auditing purposes. I already talked about the environmental reasons that are important. And then certifying the disposal process. Now, I can summarize this in one simple statement. The process of certifying the disposal is that certificate and that certification that says you have ethically and completely destroyed this specific asset can be used in an audit trail, right? When you document this, when you have it listed out, if an auditor says, hey, what 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 asset has been destroyed, when was it destroyed, and how, all you have to do is present them with that certificate and it will serve as enough evidence. Now, the last thing we want to consider here is data retention and consideration. Now, data retention is an important thing to know when it comes to cybersecurity because there are laws and different regulations that require us to either keep or not keep certain data, right? Let me do this. So what do I mean by that? So what I mean by that is that there may be some times where you need to keep data for longer than a year or 2 years. This is also dependent on what country you're logging it from, right? So an example is legal. So for legal reasons, they can only keep your data for, I think for immigration, it's about 2 years in the United States, maybe longer. Don't quote me on that. But that's important to know how long you're allowed to keep that data. The next one is secure archiving. So secure archiving is that if you do need to store data, well, then you need to make sure that you're storing the data as securely as possible. A very simple example is a form of storing data is paper. So you print data on a piece of paper and you can store it in your cabinet. You need to make sure that cabinet is stored securely, meaning that there's a very specific key that opens it. You know who has the key, where is that key at all times. If you're storing that data electronically, which is a lot more common, well, then you would want to make sure that it's stored in a place that has full encryption, that it's still accessible, that it's protected, that it's segmented to its own network. Think of it as like a storage server, right? And then periodic review of retention policies. So if you remember, I mentioned something called user access review. So user access review is associated with making sure making sure that you know who has access to what and why. Same concept goes for retention policies. In this case, you would do an audit of all of the pieces of data that you have on your network or on your system, and you want to make sure you understand why we have it and for how long we've had it. This is one of the reasons why documentation is so important, because then we can understand why data is really why data is that we need to understand why a piece of data or an asset has been kept for X number of days or X number of years so that we know that we don't need it anymore. A very common example, if you have an asset that is associated with a lawsuit, they say, hey, there was a breach due to this specific asset and we've had X amount of dollars in damages. Now, we realize that that asset was decommissioned a year ago, but it still transferred bad data into the new asset. So if we decommissioned it and we still have that data, well, then we need to be able to refer back to that data. The very good rule is you don't want to delete everything when you're working with different assets because you may need it down the line. All right. let's go ahead and do the quiz. So in the little question quiz here, A, B, C, or D, the question is, you're managing the IT asset disposal process for your organization. You have a damaged hard drive containing sensitive data that cannot be sanitized using software. What is the most available action to ensure the data is securely disposed of? A, B, C, or D? All right, let's check the chat. So it looks like everyone is saying B. Oh, sorry, I didn't post the thread. All right, so it looks like everyone is going ahead, is picking B. So Oibe, can you go ahead and select B and check that, please? All right, everyone, that is absolutely correct. So if you're unable to delete or destroy a piece of an asset through a software, you use physical destruction. This can be shredding, fire, crushing, drilling. These are all examples of decommissioning. Now, as you can see, the decommissioning process is really important. We don't take it lightly because there are a lot of reasons why we want to protect it. Very, like I mentioned before, I used to dumpster dive for different hard drives. It has yielded really great results. Additionally, dumpster diving gives me all the information that I need to essentially show the importance of decommissioning. The company in question that we dumpster dive for, this was my first time ever doing it. I didn't understand why. And it was kind of like my initiation into red teaming because you have to dig through. Luckily, there wasn't very much garbage because it was all recyclable stuff and electronics. But it was really cool seeing the forensic person pull out a bunch of data that was incredibly sensitive. The company definitely incorporated a decommissioning program after this. All right, let's go to slide 7. Alrighty, now let's talk about hardware security implementations. Now, when it comes to hardware, right, a very simple way to think about it is your computer. I like to think of your computer as hardware because it's one of the most important ways to safeguard your data. One of the things that can happen and that doesn't happen, I wouldn't say it happens like very often, only for like big companies, is theft. Sometimes someone will steal a computer that's open, meaning that you're already logged in and everything. And once they steal it, they'll have like an hour or so before you notify your IT team that something that has been stolen, right? When you have access to a piece of hardware, you have access to a lot of information. So that's why you need to have a hardware asset management program. That asset management program allows you to monitor, catalog, kind of like have an understanding of all the assets on your network and in your organization. I use the example of a computer. However, it doesn't just have to be computer. It can be servers. It can be your workstation, meaning when you walk into the office, you walk into your desk and you have a computer at your desk, that's considered a workstation. It can be different phones, any physical equipment that is used in an organization that is called hardware is called hardware. So you want to make sure you have the right tools in place to protect it. So if we scroll down a little bit from here, we'll talk about some of the implications of asset management. Now, one of the implications of asset management is inventory and inventory control. Now, you'll see this very often is the process of identifying all the hardware, right? Having a comprehensive inventory is incredibly important to the organization because it makes sure that we have a solid view of the assets in our organization so that we know the security implications if they were to be exploited, right? So having that inventory allows us to know who has access to what, and so we can pinpoint exactly where a threat might have come from. Now, this is really important because if you put your cybersecurity hat on, you'll realize that identification is essentially a process for us to be able to proactively help the incident response team. Because if there is an incident, we have everything documented, we have everything monitored, so then we can easily pinpoint where the incident started, right? Now, it's also important because we need to understand how encrypted all of our assets are. So what I mean by that is if we have a good level of encryption, if there's more encryption required, if we need to make sure that it's patched or unpatched, these are all elements of security that we need to be aware of when it comes to inventory control. Now, Lifecycle management is also incredibly important because then we need to understand if we need to go ahead and get a new computer or a new hardware, and then if we need to dispose of it. The reason why this is important is because, like the question that was asked earlier, if we have systems that have depreciated in usefulness or productivity, well, then how do we go ahead and get new ones? Well, we do so by going through that process of vetting it, as well as finding out what different systems fit what the company needs and whatnot. Why this is important is because if we find that a computer is really old, maybe it's like a 1995, it just is not compatible with the new firmware or the new hardware anymore, well, then that could be an issue. Because if it's unable to be patched with all the new vulnerabilities, well, then we put ourselves at risk. So when you retire or replace any of those assets, you're essentially taking away some of the additional risk affiliated with those risks. Now, this is where the proper disposal and decommissioning process comes in. Then there's configuration and change management. So all this means is that we have a standardized process on how to configure all of our assets. Like I talked about in last class where we talked about baselines, right? With a baseline, you have a set template of how something can be configured. In this case, we'll take the example of a router. A router needs to be configured with very specific controls when they initially get set up. And so you want to have a template to configure that. Same process goes for any other hardware. You need to have a template or standardized configuration that you can dynamically push out to all new assets so that they follow the same scheme. Why this is important is because of one word, uniformity. Uniformity means that all of the assets have a built-in system that functions in XYZ format. All right. And then we have access control and physical security. This is pretty self-explanatory. What this means is that we're tracking all of the people who are accessing all these softwares and who are using them, because then we can have non-repudiation. No one can deny that they did or didn't do what they said they did or didn't do. It's the topic of understanding, hey, that's pinpointed, okay? Now, security implications are pretty standard there. When it comes to compliance and auditing, it's pretty straightforward. When we have hardwares, well then, and we manage it accordingly, or we have like the right inventory, well then it helps us comply with the different regulations. And keyword, present evidence. Presenting evidence is really important so that we can remain compliant with all the organizations. Compliance equals trust. When we are in compliance, we're not only giving our stakeholders and customers better trust in our systems, but we're also telling the rest of the vendors that we work with that we also have the right security controls in place. Then we have VRMP. VRMP stands for Vendor Risk Management Program. Like I had mentioned before, vendor risk management is an entire industry in and of itself. So this entire goal here with vendor risk management is essentially to vet all of the vendors that we'll be working with from a security standpoint, right? So it's making sure that we have all of our vendors go through a vetting process. Now, the vetting process typically looks like a questionnaire. The VRMP resource will typically send the vendor a questionnaire. The questionnaire has a bunch of security questions listed within it. That's essentially meant to say, hey, do you have all these security controls? And then do you have all this data? Is all of this data encrypted? So on and so forth. Now, this is important because when we do a VRMP, this allows us to either pass or fail a vendor based on all their security best practices. This is important because as a vendor, you want to make sure that you're being as secure as possible. So you want to pass all VRMPs. I think that's good for that. We can go ahead and do the quiz at the bottom. So let me put a quiz thread in the chat real quick. All right, so true or false? So this question essentially asks us, classification of assets is solely based on their monetary value to the organization. True or false? All right, that is correct. Everyone's saying false. So once Oibet clicks on that, you are absolutely right in this sense, because when you're classifying assets, right, you don't, yes, monetary value matters, and it is a very big talking point by the organization because they do care about bottom line. But keep in mind, another piece of criticality in classifying your assets is privacy. So which of these assets have data that could have a huge financial impact? Which of these pieces of data could cause harm to certain people? These are examples of ways to classify it. All right, let's go to slide number 8. So we talked about hardware, right? The next thing we want to talk about is software security implementation. Now, software security is really important because when we're talking hardware, we're talking physical things we can touch. In this case, we're talking about software, which is all quote unquote logical and it's all code on a network. One of the benefits of software is that it's easier for us to control from an automation standpoint, meaning that we're able to go ahead and send out or put out a lot of different security controls on different assets based on what type of software it is. Now, one of the things that we need to make sure we do is we need to ensure that we remain compliant with all of the softwares that we're using. Remember, I brought up the term GRC in the past, right? That stands for governance, risk, and compliance. This is where the process comes in. The process of being compliant means that we have different standardizations such as GDPR and SOX stands for Sarbanes-Oxley Act, that require us to have certain security standards. So these security standards also are related to software. So why it's related to software is we need to make sure that all these pieces of software are as secure as possible. When we aren't in compliance, well, then that hurts us a lot and it can put us into certain fines. The other thing is patch management and vulnerability management. I already talked about patch management before, which means that even softwares need to be patched, not just hardware. What a patch in a software means is an update. The easiest way to think about it is an update like your phone. If you have an application and your phone says, hey, we need to update this specific application, that's an example of a patch on an application, except in this case, it can be at a business level or enterprise level. So when you have patch management, what it typically involves is making sure that you have a repository or an inventory of all the softwares and you have an active real-time list of what version they're running. Why you need that is because then if they're running an older version, you can go ahead and automate a patch. Now, a lot of organizations, especially a lot of big organizations, typically do patch management through an automated central hub. That hub will send out a requirement for your computer to auto update after a specific amount of time. Then vulnerability management, that's typically done by the security team, where they'll look at the software and at a cadence, meaning whether it's monthly, typically not monthly, but quarterly or so, they'll do a vulnerability assessment of that specific software. Something that's not really listed here is vulnerability assessments can be done in two ways. One of them is the security team does their own vulnerability assessment. That's typically done by someone in the application security team. And then another version is to just have the vendor themselves say, hey, we need to go ahead and we need to let you know that we have a new vulnerability. Typically in the SLA or the signed document, they'll typically say whether they disclose to you if there's a vulnerability and if it's been patched already, or you can discover it for yourself. Okay. When we're talking about preventing unauthorized software, as a reminder, this is called shadow IT. Shadow IT is just when you have different people of your organization using softwares that shouldn't be allowed. Now, it's not just softwares, it can also be websites. So an example of this is like transfer.com or dropbox.com. If they're trying to share a large file with an external client, they might use that. A lot of companies have internal tools that are a lot easier to use. However, they tend to be cumbersome, so they try to use those. And the way you do that is just by making sure that you're tracking who's using what, making sure you have a network tracking tool on there, and then making sure that you're teaching the employees that there are softwares that can do what they want that are more accepted. Optimizing software utilization. In short, this just means, hey, we purchased this tool. We want to make sure to use it. So when you have this new software in place, you can put a lot of tracking in it to know when people are logging in, how often they're using it. And there are even some tools out there that are able to measure productivity, whether the use of that software has impacted the bottom line of the organization or not. So the tracking of this is just to understand if we're using it completely or not. Now, when we have all of our softwares patched, when we understand all the tracking of all of our softwares, when we understand what all of our softwares are, that helps us a lot with incident response and recovery. As a reminder, like I mentioned before, when we have more information, that helps us respond to an incident better. So if we understand what our configurations are, if we know that it's using a specific baseline or specific template, if we understand the data that all these softwares are using, the incident response team can quickly respond to an incident by protecting the piece of data that need to be protected, as well as isolate it accordingly. Now, as we talked about assets, it does involve data. So the process of privacy and data security is really important in asset management. The reason why is because all of these softwares are having access to our data. When they have access to our data, we need to understand where that data is being stored. Some of these softwares, they will look at our systems for our data. Some of these softwares will copy our data into their own servers and into their own systems. There are a lot of different ways that data can be used. So it's our job as an organization to make sure we understand the sensitivity of the data that we're giving them and understand how that data is being used. Why? Is because of privacy laws. If any of our data includes EU data and one of the EU members, even just one person says, hey, I want you to delete all of my data, well, then we need to reach out to that corresponding software company if they have their data on their own server and say, hey, we had this request, it needs to be deleted. So there needs to be an agreement, typically in the SLA, that says if we get any sort of privacy data deletion request or amendment, we have to let you know and you have to comply to it within a week or so. Typically, there's a 2-week turnaround time for these privacy data requests, but it depends. All right, let's go to slide 9. So in slide 9, we talked about data, right? And we talked about how important it is. Well, there's something called data security posture. In essence, this is defined at understanding not only how secure we are, but how secure is our data. So it means that we need to understand where our physical and digital assets are, as well as how we are collecting data, how we're storing data, how we're transferring data. All of this is data centric in order to safeguard it. like we had talked about before, data is really, really important. And in asset management, it's one of the most important things we want to protect because it is one of the things that a lot of threat actors are after. Now, one of the first things we need to talk about is centralizing data. Now, when we're talking about centralizing data, right, it doesn't just mean the physical centralization of data, it also means making sure that it's available in a one-stop shop, right? Means visibility and classification. So we want to make sure that we know where data is stored, how it's being stored, and then based on how many people have access to it, who has access to it, and why, right? So we need to fully understand that process so that we know what's sensitive, what's critical, and then we have all the right security measures on those pieces of data. As you can imagine, if there's data such as public information, such as someone's potential first name, right? Sure, that's a partial piece of PII, but if that person is like, let's say, a famous person and they're using their first name, like John, well, then we'll see that as less quote unquote critical. However, if their social security number is associated with that data, obviously we want to put a lot more security elements in place. Now, with this in the lifecycle management process, we want to make sure that we're protecting it properly, right? We want to understand where data is being stored and how we need to delete or get rid of that data. If we need to make sure to destroy it physically, if we can use software to delete it, that kind of stuff. And then we have the access control process. Now, access control is one of the most important things you want to do when it comes to asset management because all of the softwares, all the hardwares, we need to make sure we know who has access to what and why, which is why granular access permissions is required. Granular access permissions is just on a deep, deep level, allowing only certain people to have access to certain things. So if you remember, there's RBAC, right? And ABAC. RBAC stands for role-based access control, and then ABAC stands for attributes-based access control. Both of these are levels of access that can be quote unquote named as granular because they're based on your role or based on what you're doing in the company. Now, it's important to have access control on all of your data because not only is that a very fundamental piece of cybersecurity, is making sure that it's only accessible by authorized users, but it helps us with monitoring and auditing. So when you have access control, we know who's supposed to have access to certain tools and who's not. And so when someone tries to have access to it, we will get a log saying this user tried to access this system and we have a log of it. And when we have that, we're able to monitor it and provide it as evidence in auditing. And then speaking of auditing, we can talk about compliance and regulatory adherence. In short, improving compliance and regulatory adherence is just making sure that we are remaining compliant with all of our standardizations. So regulatory mapping, and it's a fancy word to say, hey, what are all of the regulations and standards and laws that we have to abide by, and then how many of these controls are interwoven into each other. For example, GDPR and CCPA are very similar, and so if we have all the controls for GDPR, we have all the same controls for CCPA already. So when we do this mapping, we're essentially understanding which of these regulations we need to have in place and which of them cross over. And then there's data protection and impact assessments. Now, in short, this is just saying what is the impact if data were to be breached, right? So that's called a DPIA. So what we do is we essentially do an assessment, seeing like what would be the impact, and then we provide that assessment to the different auditors for them to validate and say, okay, you understand the impact or the importance of your data. The entire point of a DPIA is to prove to the auditors that you've done the work to understand what would happen if you had a breach. Why is this important? Is because some companies, they don't know how to quantify or give a score to their data and what would happen if that breach were to occur. So in essence, the DPIA is just saying, hey, we know how much our data is worth. Now, in cybersecurity, I keep talking about proactively plan, effectively execute, right? And in this case, it's very common for data security, where we have to proactively find all of the vulnerabilities and threats that exist in our organization. So what we need to do is several steps. One of the first things is called a risk assessment. If you remember, we talked about something called the BIA, which is the Business Impact Assessment. The Business Impact Assessment just lets us know what would happen if a certain critical business activity were unavailable to us. And then we do a risk assessment. The risk assessment is just a way for us to identify what would happen, all of the different risks associated with different assets, right? Now, the idea here is to give a value to that specific asset and what would happen thereafter if it were to be exploited. Now, we're talking about risk, right? So it says the likelihood of something happening. The vulnerability is the actual thing that can be exploited in and of itself. So vulnerability management is just the process of testing all of your assets to find out where their weak points are so that you can address them. Now, we already talked about data recovery in the past as well as business continuity. Obviously, since we're talking about asset management, we need to have a good backup and recovery system. This is where the BCP, Business Continuity Plan, as well as the DRP, Disaster Recovery Plan, come into place, because we need to make sure that all of our assets have backups. I'll repeat it again, all of our assets should have backups, okay? So that if any of them were to be hit by a ransomware, it can easily bounce back. And then we also need to talk about asset management in the cloud. As a reminder, this is related to AWS, GCP, as well as Azure. A lot of our infrastructure will be stored in the cloud again. And so we need to make sure that they have all the right security setups. If you're ever interested, you can look up AWS security for cloud infrastructure, and it'll explain all of the different types of security features there within. All right, let me put it again in another quiz thread. All right, so for this, true or false? Asset management doesn't aid in compliance efforts related to hardware security, as compliance is solely the responsibility of regulatory bodies. True or false? Keyword, solely. And everyone hit the nail on the head. That is correct. It is false. So it is not solely based on regulatory bodies. It is meant to be done by all teams. All right, next one. So network security implications. Now, what exactly does network security implications mean? Well, in short, it's regarding overall security of your network and how exactly to protect it. Well, we already talked about the AAA, so that is authentication, authorization, and accounting. Something we didn't talk about more is called Radius servers. So Radius stands for Remote Authentication Dial-in User Service. It is essentially a tool used to authenticate different users that are trying to log into the network and the system, right? Now, both the AAA, so authentication, authorization, and accounting, and Radius are both ways to essentially increase your overall security posture. The reason why is because it's centered around identification, making sure we know who the users are, making sure we grant them appropriate access, and then monitoring their access. Now, I think we covered the AAA framework in the past, so I won't repeat it. I think that it's pretty self-explanatory. You are able to review in the next time if you want. If I remember, the last time we did a quiz on this, it was pretty easy. But then let's talk about the Radius server. Now, the Radius is essentially a protocol dedicated to the AAA program. That means that it is essentially enabling users to connect and use the network in the services. Now, Radius servers can be an entire server dedicated to making sure that anyone who's trying to access anything on a network goes to the Radius server, and it's used as I would call it an ultra authentication platform. Essentially, it centralizes all of the access management into one location so that anytime anyone's trying to access anything, it goes through the server. And in that case, it allows the network to essentially, like the routers, the switches, any firewalls, to essentially communicate with the Radius server to say, hey, just so you know, so and so is trying to access this system, and that automatically authorizes them on the entire network. Now, this is nice because then they don't have to authorize at each point, at the switch, at the router. Typically, they still do have to, but with the Radius server, it gives them a lot more capability. Now, why is the Radius server really helpful? Because it tends to be flexible and you can scale it. With the Radius server, it supports a really large number of users, and it uses something called Active Directory and LDAP. So Active Directory leverages all of the users into one centralized location and then routes them accordingly. So what are some ways that you can enhance your network with Radius? Well, with Radius, it essentially does, like I said, authentication, except on quote unquote steroids, right? That means that you have two-factor authentication, it's using digital certificates, it's essentially leveraging a lot of different tools in order to have a really strong authentication process. Next one is dynamic authorization. As a reminder, dynamic means that it learns over time, right? So it uses user attributes, it uses different policies, and then it uses any information about that user and that network, such as date, time, location, and device, to know whether to authorize a user or not. And the last one is obviously logging. So anytime we're working with identity access management, so IAM, working with authorization, authentication, and accounting, well then we need to make sure we log all of those. Now, as you can imagine, anytime someone logs into something, it creates a record. When it creates that record, it gets aggregated. In one day, you can have hundreds and thousands of authentication and authorization logs, but you still need to log them so that we are able to track them accordingly. The Radius server is really, really good at that. Now, when we talk about policies, a policy is essentially an aspect of something that requires the users or the systems to adhere to a certain list of rules, right? The Radius server is really great at distributing all those rules to all the different devices. That's all it says. All right, let's go down to the quiz. And let's use the same quiz thread, okay? So in this case, we're talking A, B, C, or D. Which feature of the Radius protocol specifically allows for adjustments to user access based on context, such as time of day or Radius compliance status? We just talked about this. So A, B, C, or D. All right, well done, everyone. Thank you for paying attention. So it is, go ahead and select B. All right, well done, everyone. That is correct. Next. All right, now there is a role in cybersecurity called application security engineer. That is a role that you can look into. It's also shortened to AppSec. So this means that you are in charge of protecting the application from threats during its entire life cycle. In short, you are specifically focused on protecting the actual applications that they're working with, okay? Now, the scope of application security can be pretty broad. You typically have to do a lot of work with all applications on your network, not just one. And this is important because it helps make sure that you're protecting it through and through, okay? If we scroll down a little bit. In this case, application security can differ from company to company, but its entire goal here is intended to identify any risks, identify any issues, fix said issue, and then prevent the security vulnerability in those applications. Now, sometimes an AppSec engineer will also be involved when it comes to incident response, but it really truly does depend on the company. And then we'll scroll down here a little bit. Which, by the way, Oibek, thank you so much for sharing your screen. We really do appreciate it. I know that this was a last minute thing, so super appreciate it. Now, if you remember, we talked about security by design, right? So anytime an application is built, it's built with code. That code needs to have not just the end goal of the application in mind, but security of that end goal. Meaning, when you're processing data, are you making sure that you are preventing SQL injections and preventing cross-site scripting? Do you have validations in place? Now, in order to make sure that you're using the correct security code practices, you also have to do security testing. Security testing involves making sure that you're screening any applications for any issues and, screening any applications for any issues and making sure that they are working as expected. This can also be quoted as quality assurance. And then you have dependency management. This means making sure that if it's using any external libraries or any external piece of data, that we are securing that and securing the delivery of that data. Then access control and encryption. I think those are pretty self-explanatory. Now, why is application security really, really important? Well, for one, applications that your company uses does use a lot of important protected sensitive data. When you're using a lot of applications, they tend to go into your organization, into different servers to pick up different pieces of information. So it's important that you pull those up. And also, you want to make sure that with those applications, they can function within the business continuity plan. So the business continuity plan is focused on making sure that if the application were to go down, there's a backup application or there's another way to accomplish that business goal. Application security is also important for compliance because compliance is not just firmware or hardware related, it is also software related, dare I say a lot software related, seeing as how we're going so cloud-based. So we need to make sure that we have the right data protection controls in place, the right privacy controls in place, that we have the right access controls in place. So it's very important for us to keep that. And then there's also competitive advantage to having application security as well as financial risks, mitigating financial risks. Because when you have all of those security measures in place, you can help reduce any other risks. So how can you enhance application security? Well, you have a security first culture. I think I've talked a lot about how security first is really important to integrate into your company culture. And then you can implement DevSecOps. So DevSecOps stands for Dev Security Operations. In short, it just means that you have a development team that not only develops tools, but they develop it with security in mind. They're typically the people that help with the testing process. Another thing you can do is educate your users, educate your developers and engineers specifically. There are a lot of companies out there that pay to have their engineers take a cybersecurity course so they understand the basics of cybersecurity so that they can protect it better. Believe it or not, a lot of engineers may not be as aware of cybersecurity because they're more focused on making sure they build an application or code that accomplishes the goal. Security should become at the same level of that goal, but sometimes it becomes an afterthought. And then finally, it's using different security frameworks in order to better understand the vulnerabilities that exist out there. A very common one right now, especially for AppSec, is OWASP Top 10. If you haven't heard of OWASP Top 10, it is a list of all of the vulnerabilities that are specific to applications that exist out there. So you can go ahead and look that up yourself. The OWASP Top 10 changes a good amount based on the threats that exist out there, but it's a really great tool to know. Something also good to put in in your resume. There are OWASP top 10 rooms inside of Try Hack Me that you can do and get certified on, and they walk you through it step by step. So highly encourage you to check that out. All right, next slide. So another one is application security techniques, right? So in this, we're talking about how exactly do we make sure to keep our application secure? I can summarize this in essentially one word, which is validation. When it comes to applications, a lot of these applications require some form of input. And now the input that can be put on there needs to be validated, meaning if you have an input field where someone needs to put an email in there, you need to make sure that there's an @ symbol, and you need to make sure that it excludes any other symbols. So you say, hey, you can use alphabets, you can use numbers, but that's it. You can't use any other symbols apart from the @. That's a form of validation. Now, the validation techniques you can use are, like I said, there's where you validate the input that's coming in. So type checking, right? Where you validate to make sure that it's the right input. Whitelisting, which means that you're allowing specific information or rejecting specific information based on what's allowed. Now, as a reminder, we are changing these terms, right? Sometimes you'll hear blacklisting and whitelisting, but more often now you're going to hear the term allow list and deny list. Those are going to be a lot more common. A part of validation is also length checking, so making sure that you're not including like a massive amount of characters that are available in a field. You can just put like, let's say 90 or so. You don't really need any more than that for name, email, that kind of stuff. And then sanitization is just making sure that it doesn't include any nefarious characters. So what are some other things you can do to safeguard that data? Well, one of the things you can do is to enable HTTP everywhere. So there's an ability for you as an organization to implement HTTP everywhere on all your computers, mean that only HTTP traffic will be allowed on your network, even if it's HTTPS. Even if it's just HTTP, you can make it so that everyone goes through HTTPS. I think we can skip the rest. Yeah, let's go to number 13, just for time here. Yeah, we'll skip that quiz for now. All right, let's go through the knowledge check. And Farah, there's a technical session after this, correct? Nope, no technical session. Okay. So let's just go ahead and do this knowledge check. And I'm going to make an executive decision. We will not do the Kahoot this time, but just to jog everyone's memory, we'll do the Kahoot at the beginning of the next class, okay? So we'll just wrap up with this knowledge check and the conclusion and hopefully let you all out a little early. So let me put in a final quiz thread, and let's go through it. So question number 1, true or false? The acquisition and procurement process involves key phases such as planning, sourcing, negotiation, contract drafting, approval, and management. True or false? All right, everyone says true. Go ahead and check that. That is correct. Well done. Question number 2. Real-time location tracking systems are particularly useful for preventing theft or unauthorized relocation of physical devices, but they cannot be used for monitoring the location of digital assets. True or false? And everyone, we have a mix. We have a mix. Okay. Oibek, go ahead and for now, click false. So I want to talk about this a little bit, okay? I know some of you say, yes, it can be true that it can't track physical, but in actuality, there are tracking systems there that can locate digital assets. Now, digital assets in this case could be associated with the physical computer in and of itself. The digital asset itself can also be pieces of data. Remember, we have ways to track pieces of data and label them so that we can know where it's being used. So in this case, you can be able to track digital assets. But I understand why you would pick true. All right, question number 3. Effective asset management indirectly supports data security and privacy efforts by identifying and categorizing software applications based on data they handle, enabling the application of appropriate security controls. True or false? A lot of people saying true. Go ahead and select that, Oibek, please. All right, that's pretty self-explanatory. Well done, well done. Next one. Asset management facilitates the conduct of the DPIAs, which are required under certain regulations before processing data that could risk individuals' rights and freedoms. True or false? A lot of people saying true again. That is correct. Well done, everyone. Question number 5. AAA stands for Authentication, Authorization, and Accounting, and it primarily focuses on ensuring the confidentiality of network data. True or false? Ooh, we got some mixed bags. We got some mixed bags here. I'm seeing a lot of trues. Go ahead and select true for me, please, Orbeck. So I want to talk about this one, okay? Now, the AAA stands for Authentication, Authorization, and Accounting, right? That part is true. And then here, the key term is it primarily focuses on ensuring the confidentiality of network data. So in this case, it's listed as false because yes, it does protect the confidentiality, but not just confidentiality of network data. It's meant to protect confidentiality of everything. So that's why it would be listed as false. All right, let's go to the conclusion and wrap up here. Okay. So in short, you went through understanding everything in regards to asset management. You understand why asset management is important for incident response, identifying data, not just like physical assets, but you also understand that an asset can be a person, a software. You also understand that in order for asset management to be effective, we need to make sure to understand what assets we have in place, what specific piece of data we have in place. All of these are very specific elements to make sure that we understand our overall data infrastructure. We also need to understand who the owners of all these assets are, and we also need to classify them accordingly, not just for security reasons, but also for auditing and traceability. And then we also need to monitor and keep track of how all of our assets are being used so that we can protect them accordingly. I think everything else is pretty self-explanatory here. If you're going to take away anything from this class, I want you to hear me when I say that an asset can be anything that is valuable to the company. And an asset is people, it can be software, it can be hardware, and then it can be pieces of data. So an asset is all of those. And we need to identify and secure all of them based on its value, okay? So just keep that in mind when it comes to asset management. Everyone, do me a huge favor here real quick and say thank you to Oibek for